Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of the Authority Podcast on the B Podcast Network. Thanks for being with us here for this episode. We're going to touch on some topics around family partnerships, parent engagement, and how they relate to the roles of school and district leaders and how everybody kind of participates in that. So my guest today is Ari Gerzon-Kessler. He leads the Family Partnerships Department for the Boulder Valley School District in Colorado. And he's also an educational consultant working with schools and districts committed to forging stronger school family partnerships. Ari is the author of a new book called On the Same Team, Bringing Educators and Underrepresented Families Together. Ari, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ross. It's really a pleasure and privilege to join you.
So we don't usually go outside of the scope of the book, but I do think it's relevant to start here, which is, how did you get into the role that you're in now? If I'm understanding, I think you've been there for several years now, after being a principal, teacher, variety of roles before. But yeah, how did that come to be?
Yeah, so I was leading a school. I was a principal for about 9 years, a teacher for 7 years before that, and had seen the impact of family engagement strategies that were really meaningful. And then I also looked back on my principal years with some real regrets, wishing I knew then what I know now. And I was really drawn to the role because it was a chance to work closely with 56 schools within our district and really move steadily from the more traditional family involvement practices to the more authentic partnership ones. And I love blending research and then doing real work on the ground inside schools. So it's been a real satisfying 7 years leading the Family Partnerships Department here in Colorado.
Excellent. So the book is titled On the Same Team, and in kind of contextualizing, and then we'll get into a lot of this and then maybe some of the status quo and the barriers, et cetera, and then of course the effective approaches. But what has your experience been and perception regarding whether educators and schools and families in general, do they feel like they are on the same team or should be on the same team, or do they not feel like that? I mean, a lot of times I think of it as that schools would believe that we are, but don't necessarily do a great job of communicating that or making that so. But then families often feel as though they don't have a lot of clarity on the educators' objectives in that regard. But yeah, like, what has your experience been with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would say that I see a lot of surface level rapport and the absence of high levels of relationships, trust, and communication, especially for underrepresented families, often being on the margins of schools. And then I hear, Ross, all the time from parents, even at schools where we're making good strides, I only hear from the teacher a couple times a year. Conferences are rushed. So this sense of both sides wanting more of a relationship and not necessarily knowing the best pathways to get there. And then I think surveys show that it's the area educators feel least confident.
Mm.
So I think that translates sometimes to more status quo approaches. And I also think, as we know, with everything related to teaching and school leadership, time is such a limited resource. So I think that the absence of sometimes the confidence, the knowledge on best practices, and then finding efficient ways to do it really serves as a major barrier.
Yeah. So when we talk about the underrepresented families in this case, who are we referring to?
Yeah, so the Families and Educator Together teams that the book really was born out of, that are at 24 of our schools, the major focus is on immigrant families, families that speak languages other than English at home, families of color as well, families that in general have been othered or on the outside and not often on the same team. I was reading a quote from Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot from Harvard this morning where she talks about parents and teachers are often actually adversaries. And while I think that's a skeptical lens on it, I don't think we can assume that just naturally families and educators are on the same team and have a solid foundation. I think it requires a lot of intentionality, especially on educators' part, to build build these bridges steadily over a year. And when that doesn't happen, I think we maintain those more status quo involvement approaches where it's more gauging how many parents came to back to school night, how many came to literacy night, and not looking at what really makes a difference in supporting student learning.
Over your years in schools and in education, has there been any shifts that you've observed? Because I mean, in recent years, and this would be probably more particular to the represented families, right? This adversarial approach toward schools, toward educators, or adversarial, particularly in terms of seeing it not necessarily that me as the parent and you as the educator are in opposition, but that even you as the educator and my child are in opposition, and beliefs about what kids are supposed to be achieving or what their future is and what the role of the educators is, and I certainly believe it's born out of one, like, misperceptions, misunderstanding, or lack of caring about what educators really stand for and what they're committed to, but also some shifting, attitudes among the parents and the way that they are approaching things.
Yeah, I would say schools have become more politicized than ever in these
Mhm.
last few years. And and at the same time, I'm hopeful and optimistic. I think when we make space for parent voices and there's more collaboration, it ultimately benefits students. I also think there's a lot of practices that are now becoming more commonplace. I'm thinking about relationship-centered home visits, schools becoming more aware of the value of ongoing text and positive communication. I mean, those are some of the things that have emerged out of our Families and Educator Together team gatherings over these last 7 years, where we're really learning from parents, hey, don't bombard us with emails. Like, send us some text, find ways that will lead us to a genuine relationship. And I think, like, some of it is almost common sense, yet we're so caught in our traditional practices and what's easy for us as educators of just sending emails. That's one good example. Whereas, I don't know, when you think about your family, your close friends, I'm guessing you text them more often than you email them, right?
Mhm.
So that sense of what is most practical in building that ongoing connection both ways. So I am hopeful, and I think as a former principal, I get why it often goes down the totem pole of priorities of, oh, building stronger ties with families is a nice thing to do. And I wish more schools and districts would, see that it actually translates to a host of great academic outcomes for
Mhm.
students, in addition to just building a stronger, more inclusive, connected school community. So my hope is similar to other fields like social emotional learning, that 20 years ago people didn't know, and then 5 years ago people saw all the benefits and we really invested more, that the same thing will happen for school family partnerships in the years ahead.
So you write about the contrast between we call family involvement, the approach that many schools are taking, versus like actual authentic partnership. Can you describe what the difference is there?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an area I feel particularly passionate about. I mean, one concrete example is a shift from one way we communicated to you, we sent you the newsletter about that, we emailed you, to a much more two-way communication where we're making it easy for families to communicate with us. A couple of middle schools I'm working with, it's literally, especially for families that speak languages other than English at home, it's a one pager of, here's the name of our staff members, here's who's bilingual, here's how you can reach them, instead of just the check our website kind of involvement approach. One other, I think, really concrete example is the idea of co-creating events with families. I mean, I look back, Ross, with tremendous regret. Every time we were designing an event for families, we had zero parents and caregivers around the table helping us, even though it was for families.
Yeah.
So that would be another example of, like, shifting to actual collaboration, and then just simply prioritizing and centering relationships and care for families and trust building over a lot of the more traditional, let's tell you about our attendance policies, our grading policies, starting with what Angela Valenzuela calls like more of an institutional care approach that public schools, hospitals still take in many ways throughout our country today. So that's shifting more towards a relationship centered approach. That's what partnerships are really based on, not this like one way we're going to judge each other. I'd say that those are some examples of the shift from involvement to partnerships.
Yeah. What, I guess broadly, why does that seem to have persisted? I'm thinking particularly in the case of obviously the fact that certainly a high percentage of educators and administrators, et cetera, are parents themselves. So they would have some perspective on their own experiences and frustrations with the engagement or lack thereof they would get from their own child's school, and so that should make it easier. I mean, because so much of this, right, is about perspective taking and empathy and seeing it through
Yeah.
the eyes of others. And sure, that takes, if I'm somebody who's like working in the school, I'm going to have to also take it a few steps further to put myself in the shoes of a family that's traditionally underrepresented, right, and doesn't have that level of connection to the system. But still, it would seem that there shouldn't be a great mystery around much of what's lacking, I guess, traditionally.
Yeah, no, it's such a great point. And I mean, the reality is teachers and school leaders work incredibly hard. I think they're some of the hardest jobs that exist. And having been a principal and assistant principal for 9 years, I know how much we're stretched. And so I think part of it, Ross, is like falling back on it's easier to send a uniform email to 25 families versus doing some things to personalize it or to shift the structures. So I think part of it is really like we're overwhelmed. What's the easiest, most familiar, most safe method? However, one of my greatest learnings the last 2 years, as we came back from the pandemic and folks are as overstretched as ever, is the importance of building in time for educators to engage in some of the better practices. So I no longer am pushing a school, hey, invite me in to do a 2.5 hour home visit training. Like a month or two ago, it was have me come in for half an hour, commit to doing one home visit between January and May. And similarly, one of the best practices that made my week as a principal was carving out 15 minutes a week to do positive phone calls for 5, 6, 7 students. That adds up. That's like 200 some students by the time the year's over. But also, it's 15 minutes. It's not a lot of time. So one thing I'm encouraging principals to do is, find a staff meeting that you can end 10, 15 minutes early and weave in time for educators to engage in these practices, which will then lead them to start doing it more as their own practice. So and then I'm also thinking about the New York Times this morning had a pretty long, in-depth article about our struggles around chronic absenteeism. And one of the things that stronger family engagement does, of course, is that connection between the family and the teacher helps increase student attendance. So that's on my mind because it was showing the last 2 school years nationally, we're averaging about 27% of students being chronically absent. So that's, I think, 10 or more absences a year. Whereas before the pandemic, it was more like 13, 14% of students.
Mhm.
So to be up to where we're like nearly 3 out of 10 kids isn't coming to school on a consistent basis is a huge challenge for our system. And I really believe stronger family partnerships is one of the 3 or 4 main levers to kind of move that in a positive direction. So that's just been on my mind a lot today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems as though in kind of reading throughout, you could all sort of characterize some of the barriers that have been present to establishing better partnerships into like kind of more systemic things and then educator specific things. There's a lot of them, but what are some of those?
Yeah, we talked about barriers of time, which is relevant for a family working 2 or 3 jobs
Mhm.
or a teacher who is already stretched, taking home tons of grading. So time is one barrier. I think there's also a cultural and linguistic gap often. Majority of the US's teachers are white women. I think It might even be as many as 80% in one kind of recent study. So there's this piece of we're not creating enough space and time to invest in learning about our students and their families' culture, their home life. So I think that's a barrier. We talked a little already about communication. I mean, this barrier of most parents, especially underrepresented families, are saying, hey, can we do text? And schools are falling back more on emails and websites. So even the communication channels are barriers, and just the lack of time we're investing in, I think, relationship building and making space to listen to families' ideas around how do we create better school communities, which has been what's so powerful about these Families and Educator Together once a month gatherings, is hearing some pretty straightforward insights that then transform a school's approach. So I think those are a handful. I mean, I touch on about a dozen or more barriers. Unfortunately, there's a lot of great pathways to overcoming the barriers, but they're very real.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a variety of them from what I've kind of seen, heard, talked to people about on both sides that sort of fall under an umbrella of like intimidation, right? And it's like, particularly we're talking about underrepresented families, language issues. Okay, I am not super comfortable in my English, and when I go into the school, I'm kind of intimidated, and they don't really seem like they have a lot of time or patience for trying to connect with me, and there's not a resource for that. The only times I ever seem to hear anything from the school is when there's a problem.
Mhm.
So I'm sort of just automatically nervous anytime I'm interacting with the school because I'm used to just getting bad news from them. I want to know more, but I just don't know what are the right questions to ask. So I'm sort of nervous about initiating that conversation. On the educator side, okay, my school or my district isn't putting a lot of resources and effort into community engagement. So I kind of feel like the parents and the community have sort of a negative attitude toward teachers here. And so I'm a little nervous about trying to engage them myself because I don't know if they're really open to that, right? And all of those require like really seeing it through those lenses and saying, okay, yeah, if you were in this position, you would, it's one thing, it's kind of, it's like, oh, so much of it is show don't tell, right? Okay, we say that we want people to be more involved, but are our actions actually demonstrating that we really want them to be involved? Are our communication channels indicating that this is a one-way directive, or that we want a response, or that whatever they respond with actually matters and contributes to what we might do next? Or are we kind of doing the bare minimum, or doing what's convenient for us versus what suits them? You know, you mentioned time factors, right? Time factors, one of the simplest ones that a lot of schools have figured out at this point, but some still haven't, and seems like it shouldn't be a mystery over all these years. We have parent teacher conferences at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, guess what? Like, for a lot of parents, that's not a reasonable time for them to be able to make it to the
Yes.
school, right? And we're not providing other options. So if they don't show up, we just assume they don't care. Not that it was they couldn't take off from work or other commitments at that one particular time. Things like that.
Yeah.
That again, but if you're not used to, or you're a parent whose experience in school as a student was similar, where you didn't necessarily feel like these things were prioritized, you're carrying that with you, and you still kind of have, Asian or, nervous factor in how to interact with system.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I appreciate you bringing up intimidation because I think it's on both sides. Like you were describing, a lot of families based on their own experiences as students themselves or their kids' experience, having that distrust, fear, reluctance, and then educators, that lack of training that we didn't have on how to engage with families in our teacher training programs, and that time barrier or practice barrier. I hear a lot of principals and teachers at the middle and high school level say, yeah, I don't know if you could get my colleagues to pick up the phone and call families. That's a little intimidating. They're not accustomed to doing that regularly. I'm also glad you brought up parent teacher conferences because to me, that's an example of an easy pivot we can make from the more involvement to partnership approach. And I recently wrote a piece about this for Edutopia. Two concrete things. One is asking teachers to pose more questions to families. So it's not that sit and get information dump, And then with a minute to go, hey, what questions do you have? A lot of the schools I've been working with have made one little shift of sending home a one question on a piece of paper that simply says, what would be most important for us to touch on during conferences? And getting that input from each family to cater the conference more. And in addition to asking them more questions, the other real change has been giving parents questions that they can ask. I think, like you were touching on, a lot of families come in not necessarily having a lot of time to prepare for the conference. And so a couple of years back, I just crafted here 10 questions you can ask your child's teacher. And that builds their confidence and leads to just richer conversations. So we're not having to increase the amount of time or shift any demands on any stakeholder. It's really just making it more reciprocal and engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've referenced the Family and Educator Together teams, FETs, a couple of times. So tell us more about this. What are these teams? Who's on them? What do they do?
Yeah, they're remarkably powerful teams. I believe so much in these teams that 5 years ago they were 20% of my job. Today they're 90% because they are a vehicle for schools to do this deeper partnership work on an ongoing basis instead of the more random acts of involvement, or we're going to do one practice among some of our staff. So the teams bring together underrepresented families, teachers from the school leader once a month for 90 minutes to engage in meaningful dialogue, break bread together. So we always start with dinner and brief team building activities that get people laughing and building just safety and trust. And then there's consistently a time, Ross, where families get to learn some aspect of the school, the role of the counselor, our approach to bullying or discipline, things that we often assume families know, and they don't necessarily have that information. And as a result, we have some of these achievement and opportunity gaps because all families are not gaining access to these host of opportunities that the school has for students. So that learning time is a portion of it. And then the heart of the gathering is flipping the traditional paradigm and us treating families as experts and posing a handful of questions that get us as educators learning from them. And that's really like the bulk of the meeting. And we follow a lot of best practices for adult learning. And then another piece, there's a lot of network building between parents that happens, stronger ties between the staff and family so that it's not just the principal and a liaison or one or two special teachers that have those ties. And a final piece I would just highlight is you've got built-in staff leaders around family partnerships. And every month we're checking in and planning the next meeting and saying, okay, how do we maintain momentum? What projects can we put in place that will actually create systemic change? Because in the early years of our teams, I'd say the one weakness was we would get to May and we'd be able to say, oh, wow, there's a lot higher levels of trust. But what have we changed that have impacted the majority of staff's practices? And sometimes it was not very much. So that's something in December and January I'm regularly pushing on our 60-some team leaders so that they're identifying what are some concrete changes we can make that'll really help everyone in our school community.
Why why is it necessary to have teams? Why can't it just be something that we do?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on some of those barriers of, oh, we're so frenzied. There's so many challenges. I believe each educator, is doing 1.5 jobs. So it, I think teams are absolutely vital because leadership has to be distributed with all the things that public schools are trying to be for students, for families, for those that work in them. We need to harness teams. And there is the element of we as educators don't know our blind spots, our biases well enough. And so to be on a team where families can illuminate those pieces, as well as where we create the space for them to build those stronger relationships that lead them to reach out with a question about their kids' homework or something that will allow them to support more deeply their kids' learning at home. So, yeah, I think the team part, even if schools don't launch actual families and educator together teams, I see a strong need for teams that focus on this partnership piece because otherwise it goes on the back burner, even though research shows it's one of the 5 key levers to move from being a good to a great school or district. So yeah, huge believer in the power of the teams.
What's the appropriate level at which the team should be initiated and led? Like school level, district level, and then who's really accountable for bringing it to life, but then also like investing in the sustainability.
Yeah, I love that question. So the teams are always at a school level. We've seen that families feel much more invested when it's their own school community versus coming to give that broader perspective. And it should be initiated by schools where there's a hunger to do this partnership work better. I learned in the third or fourth year of leading the FET team effort that I didn't want to convince any principal or teacher to start a team. It had to come from their own determination. So that's a key piece of somewhat of readiness, vital to identify 2 to 5 teacher parent leaders who can galvanize the initial chapters. And the principal is a core ally in it. And I found early on that if they weren't really invested, the teams wouldn't thrive. But what's nice for principals is they play a more supportive role, and their primary job is just to sit in the gatherings and listen. So it's really sparked usually by one parent or one staff member saying, wow, we could do so much more meaningful work if we came together in a team. And then they reach out to me, and we just kind of kickstart all the steps we've learned along the way, build a really solid foundation for a successful team.
And how do you go about determining success and then kind of evaluating how the team's working, if it's working, what you need to focus on more?
Yeah, that's a core question. I mean, one is that we're getting feedback regularly from both parents and educators at the end of meetings. Like we often ask the question, what was most meaningful for you tonight? So getting some of that anecdotal data. We've also done an annual summit where we bring together parents from various schools and have some concrete data of this is how connected, this is how welcome, this is how much trust I felt for the school before I was a part of the Families and Educators Together teams, and now after being a part of it. So there's some of that real data. And then I think another way to evaluate the progress is seeing what headway are we making on staff implementing actual practices, as well as other things like if we're creating certain events, what does parent turnout look like? What does staff turnout look like? But I think it's really gauging how much progress are we making? How many home visits have staff made? How many months has the principal carved out time for us to make a few positive calls? So that's a real great gauge of success is, are we shifting more towards those partnership practices?
Yeah. And so considering the goals, objectives, the importance of creating these types of teams, how much of the improved partnerships would you say is focused on academic outcomes versus other outcomes? Seems like I'm sure there's a lot more to it than this, but to oversimplify, one of the core differences between families and educators together team as you're describing it and like PTA is that there's a lot more of the importance of the family relationships to the academic outcome and growth of students versus just the broader relationships to schools and other things that are happening. But how would you describe that?
Yeah, I would say, as you were describing, PTA tends to have a focus on events and fundraising, whereas the Families and Educator Together teams are centered on parent learning and even more so educators learning from families.
Mhm.
And then that piece of relationship and trust and really creating systemic changes to the way that the school community functions. So in terms of specifically academic outcomes, I would say when parents inform us, text would be more effective. If that opens up the door for 15, 20 texts over a semester versus one phone call, you think about how that translates to a parent's capacity to know what's happening around learning and support that at home. So there's that academic outcome piece. And then the fact that families are learning during those 15 minutes I described. Last month at 3 schools, it was, here's what the state test is called. Here's how many days it happens. Here are the subjects it's in. Here's how you can support your kid the days of the test. So there's a lot of tools that do then translate to a family knowing better how to support academic outcomes. So yeah, at the heart of it really it is about both the relationships and how that translates over into families being more a part of their child's learning journey. And I'll share one quick story. A middle school a couple of years ago in spring, a mother said, "I'm really upset. I just found out my kid is failing. Why is it April and I'm finding that out? Why couldn't I have known that in January, February?" Well, that middle school's team was remarkably responsive. And the practice they put in place to this day was every 6 to 8 weeks, the principal designates time for staff to text a handful of families with academic updates. So those families know, okay, here's where your kid's at. Here's ways we can both be part of the solution of boosting their grade. So that's been powerful to see that a parent's concern or complaint about something that was insufficient has led staff to be so responsive and doing the right thing.
Yeah. Are there, so we've looked at it a lot from obviously the opportunities and the growth and that's involved. Looking at it kind of from a different angle, are there specific types of problems that occur in schools that the implementation of these teams are also meant to prevent?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I often highlight that if we address some of the other gaps that I see in these gatherings, we would have less of an achievement and opportunity gap in most school communities. And I'm talking about information gap, communication gap, language gap, accessibility gap, and a couple others. And so I would say one problem we want to address is families not knowing about some of the great offerings the school has. That might be after school clubs, tutoring within the school day. And so one thing the teams meet is giving families information they need to navigate the school more effectively. And to make that more concrete, Ross, I mean, two examples come to mind. A number of our teams are now working on a frequently asked question document that's co-created during the team meetings with families, where it's thinking about whether it's your first day at this school or your first year or you've been here for 5 years, what do you most need to know as a parent or caregiver that'll help you feel more integral part of the school community and support your child? So that, like, the creation of that document transcends the problem that especially many of our underrepresented families, particularly newcomer families, have of, I'm not going to go on the school's website. I don't even know necessarily how to find it easily. I want information on my fridge or on my smartphone that I can pull up from a QR code. So I think that's a problem. We talked earlier about attendance. I think there's often some easy to navigate pieces that can bolster students' attendance if families and educators are more on the same page. And student engagement. We've had some great family and educators together team conversations where families have given great ideas on how schools could make class more engaging for their kid. So I
Mhm.
think, yeah, there's a host of insights that then help us navigate some of these problems more effectively.
So, for the educators, we talked kind of earlier about their relationship to kind of that intimidation piece or the confidence factor, right? That it's something that a lot of educators report that they don't have a high level of confidence in knowing how to engage and partner with families. What does the capacity building look like for them to kind of help them develop those skills as they participate in these initiatives?
Yeah, I love that question because it's one thing I'm really passionate about in terms of the team leaders. It's cultivating their facilitation skills, other leadership skills. So that's a part of my job that I love, that coaching piece. And then what's great is literally just creating the space for these 90-minute once a month gatherings builds capacity. I mean, I've met a couple colleagues from around the country who say team gatherings, home visits, they're the best PD for capacity building versus a typical training because you're right there with families and you can take risks, you can ask them questions, you can get to know them and kind of take off your expert educator hat. And I would say, Ross, some of the things we do in the FET team gatherings that make such a difference in educators feeling more confident is we break bread together. So we're eating and there's the ease of that. There's no expectations during the dinner time. We do these quick team builders that get everybody laughing. We learn We do always a quick circle with names and some sort of prompt like, what's your favorite part of spring? And it really humanizes everyone, puts them on an equal level as we kind of sit in a circle to also equalize things. And this sense that educators leave these gatherings consistently uplifted. They see not only how much parents appreciate it, but they're constantly hearing insights from families as well as appreciation. It's not, I don't want to give the impression that it's just like, what are the challenges at our school? How do we overcome them? Families will share praise that really affirm educators' efforts and give insight into, oh, those 4 teachers do that thing that parents appreciate so much. How do we move towards the entire staff adopting practices like that? So over the consistency of these gatherings, I think we also build capacity, because I think you'd agree so much professional learning for educators continues to still be more the one-off experiences. So the
Mhm.
idea of coming 9 months in a row with a variety of themes being discussed, it really steeps educators in what's real for families and what are some of the practices that can move the whole school community to a new level.
Yeah, it is. There also anything that comes to mind, I mean, for lack of a better way of describing it, that kind of schools can consider how, of course, to make use of effective partnerships toward their own self-interest, so to speak, right? Like to have engaged, powerful advocates in the parents who understand now better what's happening, what the objectives are, and they're really a part of it, right? There's a lot of things that the reason why they don't happen in schools, even though the school leader wants to do it, or teachers, either we can't get approval for the resources or we can't, is because we don't believe or we don't know if there's community support for this, or just in communities, right? Those parents and members of the community, their voice does matter, right? And if they get behind things, there's a lot more pressure to make it happen. And so of course it's not strictly to the school's self-interest, because it's good for students, it's good for parents, but things like that perhaps schools have felt frustrated by their inability to make some larger things happen, that they haven't necessarily seized upon the idea that, well, the pathway here is that we need parents to feel like this is what they also want.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're reminding me of a conversation I had with a middle school principal last month where she was frustrated that many families, especially underrepresented families, had not attended an early in the year event. And while I get that frustration, part of our conversation, because we have a high level of rapport at this point, was, well, let's look at why they aren't coming. Like, is the event appealing?
Mm.
Is it at a time that's convenient? Have they been a part of designing it? But more deeply, even than that, is, do they feel connected to any members of the staff? Have they had much communication since they arrived at this school? So I think that's a really vital piece in us shifting our mindset as educators, is both away from events to more relationships, but also when we're not seeing parents engaging and attending those events, trying to really unpack that onion and look at, okay, what are the different layers that's actually illuminating we need to do better at? Because when the relationships are stronger and there's more communication, I guarantee you those schools are seeing much higher participation by families at events, not to mention staff making the time at night to come as well. So I think, yeah, I think that's a huge lever for change that we need to look at, instead of just the more deficit mindset of critiquing parents for not coming, holding a mirror more to ourselves.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and everybody, is more motivated to be a part of something that is successful, right? So if we educators coming at night to do an event at night, or conferences or whatever it may be, right? Something that they may have traditionally done during their regular hours, and now it's like, okay, to make this work better for families, I need to sacrifice. But hey, if people are showing up and they're engaged and they're interested, I feel good about the fact that we did that. If the fact that we're now working in better collaboration with parents allows us to implement some initiative we wanted to, or try some new idea, okay, I'm feeling like the work we're putting into this is worthwhile. Are there things along those lines either from your early experiences putting together the family and educator together teams, or just things that maybe a lot of schools try as part of their family engagement practices that stand out as things that you've observed do not work? Like, if you're thinking about doing this, maybe try a different idea, because I've seen that this just doesn't really work.
Yeah, yeah, great question. And I was just thinking a moment ago, one piece is respecting the bandwidth of educators as we implement these ideas that emerge in the teams. So that's been a major learning, is it doesn't work when we're putting too much extra time on the shoulders of educators. So that's one vital piece. One is not on the front end efforting enough around the recruiting of families, or falling back on a one-dimensional approach of whether it's a regular school family event or a families and educator together team or initial gathering. Oh, well, we'll just email them and hope that they come. We've learned on the teams over the years, we need to text, we need to call individual families to invite them. We need to send something home with the student and maybe incentivize the student to bring something back that says their parents are going to attend. So that piece of one-dimensional communication almost always is kind of bound to fail. And then I think it also is vital, like in designing these gatherings, what we've learned over the years is it can't be too much sit and get, that it really has to be early on families seeing that we're treating them as experts on their child. So I'd say those are been some of the biggest kind of challenges or pitfalls, in addition to the one I mentioned of not moving quickly enough to, once trust is built, what's something concrete we can change? Because educators and family members will drop off the team if they don't see momentum, continuity between meetings, and then actual changes being put in place.
So, all right, it's been great to have you on the show here. As we're wrapping up, there's one final thing, which is, okay, so for, say, like, that's the school leader that needs to, make that shift from family involvement to authentic partnership. Is there a mindset shift involved in that? What are the kind of mental barriers we need to break through or reframe to really commit to and step into, all right, we're like changing our practices here in a meaningful way?
Yeah, yeah. I think bringing parent voice in, as we've touched on. I actually this year wrote a piece called Five Pathways to Partnerships with the ASCD that essentially answered your question of like, how do we implement this efficiently, effectively? And one piece, Ross, that comes up for me, remembering back what I wrote about it, was the importance too of starting with the why, and in that making it palatable and easy for educators. So I would often share the story of a family that says, this is the first positive call I've received in 7 years in your school system.
Mhm.
And it makes me feel greater excitement around reaching back out to the school, makes me feel more comfortable to ask questions. So I think that's a piece too for school leaders, is not just saying, here, we're going to give this a try, but like steep it briefly in the research and then try to really hit educators' hearts, and then make the very practical, efficient sell of, hey, we're going to start small, and here are the benefits for families, here's the benefits for students, and here are the benefits for you as well as our whole school community. I think those are a couple key pieces, as well as the one I mentioned earlier of carve out the time for your staff. That will make them embrace some of these really uplifting strategies, because they're not having to do it on top of everything else they've already got on their plate.
Listeners, the book is On the Same Team. It's published by Solution Tree. You can find it on the Solution Tree website or wherever you get your books. We'll put the link below so that you can click through and find that. Please also, if you have not already, subscribe to The Authority for more in-depth author interviews like this one coming your way every week. Ari has some recent Edutopia articles that we'll link to there as well, in addition to the book and Ari's social media profiles. Check out all those resources. Ari, thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ross. It was such a joy.
This episode was edited by Gage Sanderson.